Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first Digital Intimacy mini-symposia. I'm Denise Tang. I am an associate professor in cultural studies at Lingnan University and also the principal investigator for this project called Digital Intimacy Young Women and Social Transformation in Asia. I have with us, of course, also co-investigators with this project, Professor Tejaswini Nirajana, also Ritti Likos, Audrey Yu, Nitya, and Holly Howe, and also May. Maybe I can say a few words about this project first. This qualitative ethnographic project that we are putting together looks at how young women understand and experience intimacy in the age of social media. We're carrying out a multi-site study of young university-going women in 4 cities, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Singapore, and Bangalore, chosen for the high percentage of social media usage in Asia among women in the 18 to 24 age group. We aim to track 120 women, 30 in each of the 4 locations over 2 years to find out how young college-going women cultivate a digital persona of themselves and how such personae forge new ways of negotiating and navigating the realms of courtship and marriage, kinship and family, and tertiary education. This research is supported by the Research Grants Council Hong Kong and also hosted by the Center for Cultural Research and Development, a research center affiliated with Lingnan University's Department of Cultural Studies as well. So this monthly series of mini-symposia is being organized around digital intimacy. Today, we're very, very fortunate to have our inaugural, basically, mini-symposia with esteemed speakers, Paromita, VOHRA, and also Dr. Sonia Wong. Our moderator is Tejaswini Nirajana from Ahmedabad University, whom actually I have inherited this project after Professor Nirajana left Lingnan University. So I'll turn it over to you, Teju, for moderation.
Thank you, Denise. It's lovely to see so many people across Asia in particular interested in what this project might be about. I'm really happy to have with us here today Paromita VOHRA and Sonia Wong. Just a quick word about each one of them, although you will have read the biodata and you will know how there are many achievements, in Hong Kong, in India, and elsewhere. But I did want to say that the reason why I propose this pairing of Paromita and Sonia is because they are, in their own very different ways, people who are thinking about very deeply about some of these questions in a public-facing kind of way. That our project is by and large an academic research project. But we are very keen to engage with different kinds of audiences. And I think that Paromita and Sonia have shown us the way. Paromita is a renowned filmmaker. She's a columnist, also a renowned columnist. I'll get tired of saying that word. Most interestingly, as she will talk about a little more, the person who directs something called Agents of Ishq. Ishq is another word for love in India, but I'm sure she will say much more about that. It's a very, very fascinating project, and it is extremely public-facing in the sense that it's actually accumulated a large number of diverse and interesting publics around these questions. So I couldn't think of anything better, anyone better than her to address the kind of questions we are posing about intimacy. And just to repeat something that Denise has said, we are looking at intimacy not only as sexual intimacy, we are looking at friendships, at companionships, at families, to try and understand what kind of spectrum of intimacies we are engaging in with the mediation of the digital, which is now so ubiquitous, right? Sonia Wong, I have known Sonia for several years. She's, a poet. She is someone who is a social media personality. I think we would say influencer in these days. But what I thought would be something interesting she could bring to this first session, our premiere session, is her engagement in the Women's Festival that she co-founded. And I've seen the events I've attended that she's organized have had a very fascinating mix of the kinds of things that Paromita also works on in Agents of Ishq. So I think this would be a really interesting dialogue going forward. With that, I just hand over to the speakers. Paromita, I would like you to speak first. Take about 20 minutes, and a couple of minutes if you spill over is fine. And then Sonia, and after that I will begin to ask a few questions to set the ball rolling.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Teju. And it's really great to be here. Thank you also everybody who's come here. I'm very scared at the large number of people in the audience. But so I'm gonna share a presentation. Just give me a minute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of dating and the public discussion around intimacy when it comes especially to heterosexual women, and looking at it in a kind of a longer arc of what has changed and or how it has developed over the years. And so the internet as something that you use at home came to India around 1998, but understandably, very few homes had their own internet connection. And definitely in those internet connections, there were very few individual women who were using those connections, right? Most connections were used by families or they were used for work, and internet was expensive, it was dial-up. So you didn't have that degree of privacy. People used cyber cafes after some time. But I think without getting into too much detail of that time, what it did lead to was a kind of diversification, let me say, of the spaces in which and the ways in which people were experiencing intimacy. So what you would have like chat rooms, you would have a number of different forms where people were entering without really identifying themselves and were making connections of diverse kinds. And there's very few accounts of that time. Unfortunately, I think it's a very ripe kind of space for research to look at early adopters of this space and see what kinds of experiences they had. But in a little bit of anecdotal conversations and interviews that I've done, what you find is like a mix of the carnal and the tender manifesting itself, that there's a sense of friendships and there's a sense of going outside of what is easily accessible to you otherwise. I would like to say that it's not as if the internet, I don't think the internet necessarily transforms the intrinsic way in which people wish to meet and experience love. I think there have always been spaces like that, but the internet allowed a kind of amplification of those spaces. And definitely we know that for many communities of people, especially the queer community, for example, or the trans community, it became a space to find safety, to find others like themselves, to make connections, which were otherwise very difficult in the social circumstances in India. But because I'm going to mostly address heterosexual relationships, what I would say is that an interesting thing happens on the internet in the early years, which is it's the ratio of women to men, of course, and the kinds of women and men who are on the internet. And that you find that there's a particular type of woman who is really looking not to be totally within the norms, but not necessarily looking to transgress norms, who's looking for a different kind of intimate life. And also true perhaps of some of the men who are there, many of the men who are there. And I think there's something to be understood about the idea of what is, can there be an understanding of what is a vanguard intimacy? Is there such a thing? Because what we've all grown up with and been told is that intimacy is, vanguard intimacy is something that is, rooted in this kind of a free love idea of the 1970s. It is something that is mostly promoted by men as being uncaring of norms, uncaring of whatever kind of moral niceties and relationships, and a sort of a free-floating idea of a profuse sexual life. And that's always been the way that people have understood a vanguard intimacy. But my question is that if we look actually at how queer people and women use the internet for intimacy, we might develop a different understanding altogether of what constitutes a vanguard intimacy, in the sense, what is it that actually changes the nature of intimate life over time? There was a study done between 2008 and 10, I think, which was published in the Erotics India report by Manjima Bhattacharya and Maya Ganesh. And they interviewed a number of middle-class women who were on the internet. And what they found is that women wouldn't easily admit to using the internet as a space for sex or desire. But when interviewed anecdotally, they would talk about all the different ways in which they could express their sexuality online. And this was a very kind of an unboxable idea. So it was about appearing sexy or experiencing yourself as a sexual being. As phones began to enter the space, the idea of photographing yourself and and presenting yourself to others as a sexual person, whether you were married or not, was something that was very important. The desire for attention, as this excerpt from the interview says, after my wedding, I was so alone, and I'm still so alone. After marriage, children, no one is interested in you, no one is bothered, and you also lose interest in your body. But the desire is still there for attention. When another person sees it and is interested, then you also become more conscious and aware. I like it. So this idea that your relationship with yourself and the relationship of who is a self was very much present in some of the interviews that I've done in this very interesting study, which you can easily access online. But when we, over time, I think what we see is that, of course, more people are using the internet, and we come to the present moment where there are dating apps where the idea of using the internet for intimacy is something almost routine. And there's a lot of public conversation about it. But I think it's framed by a certain reality, that there is a very big gender gap in the way that the internet can be accessed, that mobile ownership and access to the internet is skewed very much in favor of men, and that women who are able to access the internet are often heavily surveilled. And of course, today we also know that there's a huge amount of violence that you have to face online, there's doxing, and there's all kinds of precarity, sexual precarity that is involved with being on the internet. But that doesn't mean people don't use it. And I think, again, it reflects the way in which people have always sought pleasure, even while being well aware of risks, and not mindlessly, but with their own kind of strategies for managing this risk. On dating apps, I mean, currently there is again a heavy difference in the ratio of men to women. Right? There are a lot more men and far fewer women. So I think, like, I'm not going to dwell too much on what is reported as a result, right? What you'll have in terms of reporting on experiences on dating apps by women would be that, you know, it's violent, that men are often very crude, they don't respect consent, they don't respect privacy, so on and so forth. This mirrors a lot of conversations around gender offline as well. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I think what is more interesting to look at, and that is something that both through Agents of Ishq, which is a multimedia website that I run, which looks at experiences that young people, but not only young people, have on the around love, sex, and desire, through their granular kind of engagement with them, and also through other conversations while writing a column on modern love in the newspaper. I think you see the way that people talk about the terms they come up with, the language that develops around being on the internet and looking for love or desire, and it gives you a sort of different picture. So I'm not sure if you can read all of these things, but we asked people on Agents of Ishq this question: what do you love about dating aajkal, nowadays? What do you like about modern dating, and what do you hate about it? And there was a kind of a lot of people loved it. Like, they loved it because it meant variety, it meant freedom, it meant the possibility to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes. It meant being able to connect to people whom otherwise you might not encounter. And the idea that all relationships don't have to lead to marriage has disappeared. You're able to experiment. And that idea of experimentation seemed to be very valuable to young women. But there was also a deep sense of missing intimacy. There was a continuous expression of the fact that you have to curate yourself to seem casual, and that it's unfashionable and old-fashioned to show that you really care, and it's difficult to form a connection. There's a sense of dishonesty involved in that. So I think it's interesting because on the one hand, you have a certain kind of moral honesty that is experienced, that you don't have to conform to old-fashioned ideas of being a good girl. But on the other hand, there is a kind of psychological dishonesty that you must play out by pretending that you don't want deep connection, because deep connection is unfashionable. And I think so it's not just about the fact that there are large numbers of men, there is a certain sexism, etc. But what is interesting is that the notion of what constitutes a liberated sexuality is still determined by these rather old-fashioned, according to me, notions that have been determined by certain kind of allegedly vanguardist men, right? And that women are expressing a dissatisfaction with it, even a hurt, a feeling of disrespect, but they don't have a proper language in which to articulate it. So they are more comfortable admitting to it in these kinds of semi-private spaces like Instagram sticky questions. And I think, 1 second, there's also a number of acronyms and a number of special terms that have come up around dating. These are not only limited to India. Of course, there are generally terms that have arisen from dating on the internet. So no strings attached, one night stand, friends with benefits, Facebook official. That's when you're actually in a relationship, then you make it official by saying in a relationship on your Facebook on your Facebook profile. Define the relationship, DTR, DTF, down to fuck. But there's also below, as you can see, a number of far more ambivalent kind of terminologies like ghosting, breadcrumbing, paper clipping, scene zone, friend zone. Now, all of these experiences actually are speaking about the difficulty of ethicality online. So while there is a great deal of experimentation, there's difficulty in discussing the ethics of this experimentation and no space really to discuss it. So you have a lot of, the digital allows for experiences like ghosting to be very common, which is somebody completely disappearing from your life after a period of intensity and intimacy online, or the idea of somebody leading you on for a very, very long time. And then, and of course, these behaviors occur on both sides through both genders, but you have an overwhelming reporting of these experiences by women more than by men. The idea of the internet allowing for a lot of options and discouraging decisions or discouraging commitment of some kind is something that troubles people. And I think what is underneath the trouble is really the inability to create a language where we would be talking about ethical choices and ethical desire as opposed to normative desires. And I think around the idea of love, sex, and desire today, there is a sort of sex positive discourse that has arisen. And I'm going to spend a little time discussing this idea of the word problematic being used for everything and what the sex positive discourse is seeming to do to people within and to their idea of intimacy. Because I think we have to think about social media no more as a space, but as a form. And the form of social media is that it makes a kind of continuous disciplining possible. It actually continuously creates conformity because it is a format that's very, very short. It's more given to absolutes, to making declarative statements, to saying what's wrong and what's right, and a kind of sorting, because that's how the algorithm works as well. So in fact, it is imposing homogeneity in the name of heterogeneity often. So that is why it's very tricky. So you feel, and of course, it's always full of the potential for disruption. You can always disrupt that algorithm. You can always say something else and it can catch the interest of people and become popular. So it's not that it's absolute, but just like with social norms, it sort of gets enforced over and over again, sometimes seeming to be about freedom, whereas alternative ideas sometimes struggle to find space and they take time to come to the surface. One of the things that also came alongside this kind of growing freedom of women online and self-expression is that there was a huge discourse around sexual violence following the gang rape in Delhi in 2012. And a big conversation about sexual violence and sexual safety for women emerged. And I would say that a really key kind of moment in that, in terms of media, was something called the Creep Kavali. And it was made by a very successful and popular online YouTube channel called All India Bakjot, since then disbanded over some allegations during the Me Too movement in 2018. But the Creep Kavali was basically very, very entertaining song of two women talking about a kind of stalker they have in their others inbox. And discovering that this creep, as they called him, was the same person who was stalking both of them. And the typification of the creep is typified as somebody who doesn't speak English well, who's not in your friends' inbox. So it's not somebody who's in your social circle or larger social circle. So it's a kind of what in Hindi would be called a paraya mard, right? Like you were always told when you were young or in the popular culture, the idea that paraya mard, somebody who is not of your caste, not of your class, not the right kind of man for you to meet. So, and then this video was very popular. It was made for the dating app, Truly Madly. And this idea that the app is a better place for women because it sorts people out on the basis of identity is really interesting because it's kind of enforcing a purity on women. And it is allowing men to say that we are the ones who protect women and care for women. We are the right kind of guys. Since then, of course, there's a term for this, the bro. So it's a kind of a bro type of guy who talks for women and women's rights and says there are other kinds of men, usually of different castes and a different kind of social background, that who are always a threat to women. So you see a way in which this conversation about sexual safety enforces a purity on women without them seeming to even realize it. In contrast to this, I think when we started Agents of Ishq, it was very much to counter this kind of false discourse of sex positivity, right? Like seeming to be caring about women, but always being about sexual safety and almost never being about freedom. So Agents of Ishq is a space where we are totally non-normative and non-prescriptive, and it's highly rooted in experience. The whole thing on Agents of Ishq is that actually there are no declarations. There is some information on sexuality, of course, sex ed information, as you say, on sexual health, on STIs, and so on and so forth. But it is primarily made up of people's experiences and wants to root itself in the experiences of queer people and women only. There were not that many experiences of heterosexual cis men that we invited. And I think what emerges from those stories, again, is a desire to have a different description of what is sexual liberation or sexual freedom. For example, this piece by an older woman, Longing is the Spice That Makes a Meal of Sex for Me, is about a no strings attached affair that she has with somebody she meets on the internet who's younger than her. She's a married woman, and he thinks this will be a convenient relationship because it won't get emotionally entangled. And her contention is that this makes it sexually uninteresting for her. That, of course, I was new to flinging, she says, and flinging is addictive because it is light. That's the key. It is so easy that it feels like you are a solo traveler breathing in freedom as you wander off to destinations of your choice. But without longing, it feels a little pointless to me. You carry the fragrance of your favorite flower, but never allow it to linger around. And the most important line for me is when she says that longing brings a flavor to savor. It's not necessarily an indication of commitment. So the idea that you're looking for a different kind of sexual experience and that is constantly being slotted into an old-fashioned idea of commitment, I think that courses through a lot of what women are saying. In another essay by a young man, actually, there's a conversation about how this kind of forcefulness of sex positive discourse doesn't allow for thinking about other kinds of relationships which are also intimate and which are romantic. And of course, since this article came to us, there is a much more developed discussion about asexuality. So you also do see that by allowing a granularity of experience, you actually break the idea of a new norm that is created through sex positive content, right? And as he says, in a world where we're increasingly told that to be radical, you have to be okay with embracing the physical with no strings attached, we might be even more radical in straying a bit from the sexual, to not cut all strings, but look for other types of strings to attach. From a young queer person who talks about how finding that it's not that she was struggling with being homosexual, but actually looking for a language of intimacy. When I realized I was queer, I learned the language of identity politics, not just to find myself, but also because I felt I'd never be accepted into the queer community without it. But somewhere it failed me because it allowed me to hide my innermost desires for love and intimacy behind it. I think what we see on the internet, especially on Instagram now, so there is a proliferation of sex positive accounts. And these are sex education accounts, but they continuously set up what I would call marketable transgressions, right? They're talking about the idea that there are several taboos, and then they position themselves as important because they're going to smash those taboos. But in a sense, they only set up new norms of what it means to be a sexually free person. Because of the form of the internet, they tend to focus a lot on things like sexual information. Now, sexual information, while it's very important to give, especially in a country where there's hardly any sex education, the question becomes who is developing the syllabus for that sexual information? Where is that syllabus actually emerging from? And it's usually from a kind of pre-existing roster of what is sexually positive, sex positive, rather than what I would call pleasure positive, which is allowing people to discuss a variety of intimacies which are rooted in the experiences around them, and to speak about it in terms of relationality, because that's really the struggle. And what happens to the idea of relationality, and how are all these experiences that are expressed in what I just went through, and which I hope we'll talk about more in the Q&A, those get actually only slotted into language of some amount of gender politics and some amount of very legalistic discourse on consent. And I think it's important to ask some questions about the consent discourse right now, because in this yes means yes and no means no, there is such an absolute and such an absence of context that people also struggle to make sense of it in their lives. And what it ends up doing somehow is creating a fresh set of norms that, and a kind of decorum, what I would call a feminist decorum, where women have to already know everything that they feel. That the idea of entering a space and exploring it and understanding what you want from it. And what I would like to call the space of the maybe. And I'll show you a video at the end of it if there's time, which talks about the space. So the idea that between the yes and no is a huge spectrum of feelings, which are about different intimacies, different kinds of choices, a kind of gauging of what is the nature of these relationships, quite outside the very clear-cut norm of it's a hookup, it's an NSA, this is a committed relationship. So the idea that there's a kind of a spectrum of feelings that can be explored in this maybe, and they all require different kinds of negotiations of consent. I think those get absolutely lost. To my mind, it becomes that you make sense of intimate life, not on the terms of intimate life, but you make sense of it through a legal discourse. And it has to live up to that legal framework. Otherwise, it's somehow a failing discourse. Whereas actually, intimate life itself offers up these rich ideas of how consent or ethics or desire can be understood. So in a sense, using the sensual as a place of understanding and as a place of knowledge happens very little. And it can't happen actually without an innumerable accumulation of people's experiences. So in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is it's a kind of literary form, this idea that you continuously talk about your experiences and you come to an understanding of how you can respond to different situations, being the unique person that you are. I think this article that we received on Agents of Ishq expressed very clearly the difficulty with the constant discourse of this is problematic, that is toxic, these are red flags in a relationship, a surrounding kind of, it's a surround sound for dating. Conversations about what's toxic in intimate relationships are incredibly important. But the tight framework supposed to help me realize the truth underneath my relationships sometimes just erode my confidence in my own judgment about who I am. Although I know this intellectually, these judgments and absolute declarations are so noisy around me, and I find it hard to be immune to them. Viewing relationships and behavior through the prism of these external standards makes me feel more alienated and clueless than I ordinarily and actually do when I'm romantically involved with someone. A strange second guessing starts to creep in. As a feminist, I do place upon myself the responsibility of ensuring that I must make a fuss about something if it seems toxic to me. If I don't, and if I rationalize it with other factors, I find my self-concept, my idea of my beliefs under attack. If the internet is telling me that something is wrong and so many people in the comments to such posts affirming that they ignored the red flags talked about, am I just making excuses for myself or my partner? So it's an interesting thing that it actually hollows out a sense of agency because you're supposed to conform to what is a generic idea of a good relationship. And this, in my mind, is creating a new virtuous feminist, right? It's where you have to be a virtuous woman and be monogamous and be faithful before. You now have to be a new kind of virtuous feminist person who already knows what the red flags are, avoids all those pitfalls, and leads a kind of exemplary consensual sex life. Am I out of time, did you? Yes, right?
You can take another couple of minutes.
Well, okay, I'm just going to show you then 2 or 3 minutes from the what is called the Consent Lavani. You can easily find it online. And actually, I'm doing it mostly because you must be so bored of listening to me talk that I feel you deserve some pleasure at the end. So this is a video about consent that we made many years ago and which explored this idea of the maybe. But the special thing about it for me is that we made it in collaboration with Lavani dancers. It's a dance form that's a kind of courtesanal dance form, I guess. And because it is so deeply rooted in a kind of language of desire, I think it allowed us to soften and explore the discourse in a way that was a little bit more true to life, right? So.
जेव्हा म्हणायचं हो तेव्हा हो नको ते नको
पर आपल्यालाच खात्री नसते तेव्हा कधी वाटतं हो कधी वाटतं नाही तेव्हा काय करायचं ग
मे बी
पण ते पुरुषांना कुठं समजतंय
ज्याला समजतं तो हिरो नाही समजलं तो झिरो हा पाहुणा कुठून तरी आला मी भुलले त्याच्या कच्चा अंगाला तो म्हणला चल माझ्या संगा चल उधळूया इश्काचे रंग मी म्हणली बेबी 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 मी म्हणली बेबी 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 बेबी
अगे ह्या लोकांना मे बी म्हणजे होच वाटतं.
तो म्हणाला
Of course. I can wait for you, baby.
वाव म्हणजे त्याला तुझा पॉइंट मिळाला.
भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा मिळाला शेवटी भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा कळाला शेवटी भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा कळाला शेवटी भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा कळाला शेवटी भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा मिळाला शेवटी भेटला हो जरा पॉइंट माझा मिळाला.
Thank you.